Tell me about what you mean by magic.
What I mean by magic. Okay. Uh, so I can break this down in a few ways. I tend to think about magic first off as a suite of psychotechnologies, which are specifically used to influence and shape consciousness. And increasingly, I think that that is the tool by which one also affects the kind of neurodynamics which govern the various interacting parts of the cognitive system. So that is how I think about it, frontline with the purely naturalistic cast on it. I don't exclude that there may be, other phenomena attached to it which are more difficult to explain. I think that there is some interesting evidence for that, but I think the first thing is just grounding it out in a set of concepts that we already have at hand in cognitive science, right? And this notion of the psychotechnology, which is a kind of in a sense, an acquired cognitive capacity, right? So the prototypical example of this is literacy, right? Literacy as a psychotechnology. If you drop a human being in any language environment, any spoken language environment, they'll absorb it, right? We're sort of pre-wired for that. Literacy, on the other hand, the linking of speech to, various kinds of symbols, which are at some levels sort of arbitrary, right? We have to drill that repeatedly. It is, in fact, a kind of acquired synesthesia. But nevertheless, we can acquire that synesthesia to such a depth that it enables certain kinds of, cottage industry gold standards in psychology, like the Stroop effect, right? So you're familiar with Stroop?
Tell me about it.
Okay, the Stroop effect is it really is a kind of gold standard in psychology for kind of cognitive load, etc. So the idea is that when you're doing a Stroop test, you put a word up, which is a color word on screen. For instance, the word red, right? But the word may or may not be written in the color red phenomenologically. So it could be red written in the color red, or it could be red written in the color, say, blue. The idea is that when you give somebody the Stroop test, they should be calling out the phenomenological aspect. They should be calling out the color in which it is presented, not the word. Um, and generally speaking, what you see is that Stroop, under sort of various conditions of cognitive load, of gradual exhaustion, whatever, people begin to see a bigger and bigger Stroop lag, right? A bigger Stroop effect where they call out the word instead of the color, right? So they can't quite separate it. Now, what that's meant to indicate, obviously, is that you have these two, processing pathways, which are in a sense in competition, right? They want to say two different things in the same domain. One wants to call the color, and the other wants to call the word, and they clash. And so, you get circumstances when people are tired, distracted, right? This thing happens where it might be written in the color blue, so they should say blue, but they say the word which is written red, it takes them longer to process, or it takes them, they say one and then have to correct themselves, etc. Now that's such a robust effect that there are, so far as I can tell, only three conditions in which you see a reduction or an elision of the Stroop effect. So one is illiteracy, obviously, right? If you can't read the word, then you're not going to get any interference. And if you ever want to muck up some grad student's, Stroop experiment, you can take your glasses off so that you can't see the word, at which point you will just be able to invariably call the color, but don't screw up the research. It's important to them. So that's one. But the other two, interestingly, are we see an ability to reduce Stroop effect with advanced meditators, which indicates that there may really be some kind of improved cognitive attentional control, right? That allows them to more selectively, choose what it is that they're dealing with. So advanced meditators seem to be able to reduce Stroop effect. And interestingly, the reduction or elimination of Stroop effect was instrumental in the sort of, I don't know, whatever, experimental demonstration of hypnosis. So RAZ 2007, RAZ 2007 really put this on the map in Montreal, when they did a set of experiments where, effectively speaking, they hypnotized people to be illiterate, right? They hypnotized them out. And the fact that they saw this reduction in their Stroop lag, right, was itself an indication that there really is a kind of dissociation occurring, right? This puts it on the map in an uncontroversial way using a very standard task. But the interesting thing from my perspective about this as psychotechnology is that we're talking about an acquired synesthesia. There is nothing natural to the shapes of letters. We have to drill kids on this. And interestingly, when people are talking about synesthesia mostly, they're talking about a crossover in terms of sensory or processing modalities of various kinds, right? So I know somebody for whom, for instance, individual numbers, numerals, have personality. And I've heard of a couple cases of this. So, you ask a kid who's got this, what's 7 plus 9? And their answer is, well, 7 and 9 would never hang out, right? Which sounds like nonsense, but they have these robust associations. Far and away, the most common form of synesthesia in this sense, at least in the English speaking world, is a kind of color letter association. Um, and what's particularly interesting about that to me is that somebody did some analysis and showed that in a large number of these cases, it maps to the color letter association seen in the plastic magnetic Fisher Price letters you stick on your fridge. So people have picked up this sort of link and internalized it to a significant extent. But the point is, it's acquired. It's acquired and yet becomes so automatic that we can use it reliably as a as a kind of counterpoint to other forms of processing, right? So this idea of being able to drill a set of links into your head and then have them be like so firmly instantiated is very often what the sort of mechanism that the psychotechnology is working on, right? That it can create these kinds of automatic links, for instance, and thereby give us capacities that we would not otherwise have. So I tend to think of magic at the front end as being a set of psychotechnologies, right? Which enable us to engage with the processes of our cognition in a way that we would not otherwise be able to do so. And then furthermore, I have more sort of speculative ideas about what sorts of capacities that opens up and how those relate to the sort of, I don't know, magical corpus or commonly reported, forms of experience, if that makes sense.
It's interesting with reading language. So it's a very hard skill to learn. And then with the Stroop effect, we actually can't unlearn it in a way. So we actually get the task wrong. So the thing I'm noticing is that we can learn psychotechnologies and they're really valuable, evidently, with writing. But then our cognition kind of gets stuck there. There's also ways in which it shapes your cognition more than you realize. So is that important? I mean, and writing is just one form of psychotechnology. Like, tell me about the importance of these kinds of things.
hmm Um, yeah, I mean, certainly it's the case that, a psychotechnology, like any other sort of whatever acquired heuristic method of processing, right, is subject to the no free lunch hypothesis, right? So the no free lunch hypothesis basically says that for every condition in which something is advantageous, there is an equal number of conditions in which it is detrimental. So in every condition that a heuristic improves your processing, there's an equal number of conditions in which it is a bias and therefore is screwing with your processing. That's just a general feature of cognition. You can't shape anything without creating a set of circumstances where it's going to screw you up. And so the question is really about phase function fit and how you chain these things together and so on. But within magical traditions, I mean, there are certainly a couple of sort of direct instances that I think of here. So, you know, literacy isn't the only psychotechnology we're talking about, right? Literacy, numeracy is certainly a psychotechnology that one onboards. But so are things like meditation. Meditation, mindfulness meditation or concentration meditation are not, they're not natural to us. They're something in a sense that we need to train to be able to train up to, certain kinds of high levels. And certainly we see lots of concentration-based practices. Most magical practices, in fact, require that you develop some measure of sort of concentration practice first before you even engage with, very much like most meditative practices do. Um, there's a couple of ways this shows up that I think are interesting. So one is that many magical traditions, most I would say, maintain what you would call a system of correspondences. So in the West, in the Middle Ages, we had the doctrine of signatures, which was really the dominant form of knowledge structuring prior to the rise of the scientific method. And the idea was that, in a sense, the world is expressed in the language of God, right, which can be read symbolically across category. And you can see numerous instances of this where people assembled these tables of correspondences, which were meant to indicate a kind of underlying essence behind disparate phenomena, right? That, in a sense, is sort of archetypally structured, right? So if you are interested in dealing with the goddess Aphrodite, that would be the planet Venus and the color green and the metal copper and perhaps the smell of roses, and right. And so this has a sort of a dual function. You drill this set of associations if you're a practitioner within a given tradition. You drill this set of associations. The set of associations is then used to evoke or invoke the energies in question. Right? If you want to summon the energies of Venus, you do it on a Friday, and you use copper, and you use green, and you make sure these things are involved. So you're drawing on those associations in order to perform the act. But also, you see lots of cases in which um, experiences that one has, visionary experiences or imaginal experiences, for instance, are tested against those systems. So things come up and they are sort of judged by the extent to which they conform to expectation in that sense, right? It has that dual property. This idea of onboarding a table of correspondences or a system of correspondences was really, really central to sort of medieval knowledge production and thinking, and absolutely central to most systems of magic. Right? You get, your various gods or spirits. They have certain kinds of portfolios. You appeal to the appropriate party in a polytheistic way in order to achieve certain kinds of effects or achieve certain kinds of knowledge or commune with certain kinds of entities. And this remains true for the most part, even in traditions that are monotheistic, right? So, Catholicism is nominally monotheistic, but in fact it has, the Trinity plus Mary plus the saints plus the angels, right? And people regularly make appeals to those specialized beings as a kind of sub-department when it seems like a bit much to, consult the absolute about, finding a parking spot or whatever. So when we look at those systems, Umberto Eco, the novelist and semiotician, wrote about moving through these systems of correspondence or tables of correspondence in what he called hermetic drift. So you're moving from association to association in a certain kind of way. And this is a way in which you can sort of read the text of the world, what is called kind of magical thinking, and what, if you're not careful, becomes, sort of paranoid ideation if you're not careful with it. But the notion that I see in the actual use of these systems ritually is that, in fact, they act as a kind of constraint on cognition, which is assistive. So if you construct, okay, let's say that you do have all of those Venus associations internalized, perhaps not to the same level as literacy, but it's a very ready kind of association. And you construct a ritual space in which you are dressing it, basically, dressing the set and things, so that your sense modalities and such are, no matter where your attention strays, it strays to something which is archetypally associated with Venus in that system, right? Well, that means that you massively increase the odds of your ability to concentrate on that concept, that notion. In fact, it sort of enables, to borrow John Vervaeke's term, a sort of soft focus over a hard vigilance. So, your attention can stray, and if it strays to one sensory modality, it naturally loops back, right? So that you end up with this concentrative structure which aids you in your concentration onto a certain kind of principle, right? Um, which I think is just one aspect of this. But the point is that it's very clear that when you look at for instance, Renaissance magic. It's deeply, deeply tied up with things like the ars memoria, right? Arts of memory, to what people would think of the memory palace, famed from Sherlock, although not maybe totally accurately represented. Um, yeah, you get things like the memory palace and other kinds of mnemonic tricks. Well, those things were deeply embedded together with learning these systems of correspondence. And while those systems differ from culture to culture and system to system, their presence is almost invariable, right? It tends to be sort of baked in to every polytheistic system, right? You have to have, there's a god of this and a god of that. There's nothing left out. So anyway, does that answer that question, or do you want me to dig in somewhere?
No, I want to dig in on when we say there are gods and then they have associated colors, smells, metals.
Yes.
Someone who is more modern, scientifically minded might go, okay, but why? You're saying there's these associations, but are they arbitrary? And why should we care about using the associations to invoke the spirit, the principality of that?
Mhm. Sure.
Of that.
So, on one hand, uh, on one hand, I'm sure various practitioners would argue that there are, whatever rational reasons of resemblance which bind these things together in some way. And in fact, you'll get plenty of commentary on that by medieval scholars who will talk about why such and such a thing is associated. But I don't, strictly speaking, think that's necessary. See, the thing is that they can be arbitrary, which is to say that they can be conventional, right? And convention is often arbitrary. It's entirely arbitrary in some sense, which sounds we use to express which words, right? I mean, shit, even onomatopoeia, which is supposed to be a word which resembles the thing in question. Look at what the noise for cat is in English, meow, versus the noise for cat in, Japanese or something, which I can't remember what it is, but it's like nay, nay, something. The point is, right? Like, at what level is that arbitrary? Well, it's highly arbitrary. There's nothing in particular that links the shapes of an English letter to the sound that they make, right? It's simply arbitrary, but it's conventional because we all agree to the same standard, right? In the same way as we all agree to base 10 numbering, or we all agree to, leftover Babylonian numbering in our clock systems, right? All those 60s and 12s. It doesn't matter that it's arbitrary to do so, provided that it is conventional, right? That we sort of agree on those conventions. The other thing is that, yes, you can quibble about whether or not, say, the principle of Aphrodite Venus love, right, is whatever, essentially metaphysically linked to copper. I don't even know how that would be or whatever in the scientific framework. But that's not the point. The point is that you can shape your own cognition in important ways by internalizing a set of associations, right? You can create a set of associations. And the question then is, well, okay, what benefit does that have? What can you do with it, right?
What can you do with those kind of psychotechnologies of association?
Yeah. So, I think there's a variety of things. So, as I mentioned, increasingly when I'm considering this material, I'm thinking uh, more about mm, the contact of parts. This is the naturalistic frame. So, are you familiar with Panksepp?
Tell me a bit about them.
Okay. Panksepp was a theorist who did, he was also a theorist, actually, he was an experimentalist who did effective neuroscience. So specifically, he kind of got his early career doing testing of neural circuits in various animals, rats, etc., right? And what he would do would be sort of insert a small probe which would electrically stimulate an area, okay, which, they had attempted to isolate anatomically, and then they would activate that circuit, and the rat would have an opportunity, for instance, to either leave the circuit on or turn the circuit off. And in that way, Panksepp was very simply trying to distinguish between affective circuitry, emotional circuitry, which was pleasant, basically, versus unpleasant. Like if a rat wants to turn it on, we assume it's pleasant or at least compulsive. If you turn it on and a rat wants to turn it off, we can assume that it is unpleasant, that there's a negative valence there. So that is kind of the start of his work. In the middle, he began to elaborate those systems specifically as he believed that they existed in humans. And so he defined a set of circuits, which, in a way that's somewhat hard on the eye, he expresses in all caps. Uh, so it's a little like reading a text from grandpa. But he has these circuits. So there are, for instance, the rage circuit, all caps, right? And the rage circuit is specifically concerned with the anger system and how the anger system in both animals and humans gets activated, generally speaking, when goals are thwarted. So if you think about putting yourself between, your dog and its bowl of food, and if you want to get a growl out of a dog, putting yourself between it and its food is a real good way to do that, right? Thwarting its goals. And if you think about the way that anger expresses itself for people, it's typically the same kind of thing. When people feel that their goals are thwarted, either directly or, symbolically speaking, they will tend to get mad real fast, right? There are a variety of circuits. He defines 7, and in his later work, I think 8. But there's rage, care, play, grief, rage, care. Can I remember them all off the top of my head? Anyway, the point with these systems is this. They are universal systems. So if you're interested in finding the common core in some sense of effective cognition, this is what Panksepp is trying to do. In his very late work, he makes a bit of a career shift and he starts tickling owls, which is both the best job in the world because you can totally tickle an owl and it will laugh. You can tickle mice too. And so I encourage everybody, no matter what their day is going like, to go on YouTube and just type in Panksepp, Panksepp, and watch by tickle rats, and rats chase his hand around to get tickled because this is delightful. So what science should be doing with its time? Tickling things. Anyway, so how does this link in? These basic affective systems, in my opinion, right, are in some sense, massive pre-linguistic systems which color our thought, right? And the link has been made many times between emotional systems of various kinds and the gods, broadly construed, right? So if you're thinking about something like the rage circuit, right? The rage circuit and linking that rage circuit to, say, Mars or Aries and the principle of war, red, iron, blood, right? This is a great big categorical system. Now, I don't want to sort of overextend my claim here. I have played a lot with the idea of directly mapping those Panksepp systems onto sort of various, powers or principalities, and I think that works reasonably well. But I'm not claiming that that's an absolute link. However, what I am saying is that the ancients, even recognized often that to be possessed by strong emotion or strong feeling was a kind of madness, and that madness, in a sense, was identical to the god. So if you are caught up in lust, right, then you are, in some sense, literally possessed by Venus or Aphrodite. Now, for the most part, I think, as human beings, we mostly get pushed around by those systems or led by the nose by them, right? They're extremely powerful and they can color how you see everything, right? That can be, useful in various ways, right? Each one of these systems has utility in a certain sense, right? So a rage system can help you form a boundary, for instance, in a condition where somebody is, crossing boundaries inappropriately. But what we often lack is any kind of more direct way to interface with those systems. We just experience what they're throwing at us. My suspicion is that one of the advantages of doing kind of entity work, in a sense, is that it's like an extended version of the sort of parts work that you see in say, depth psychology or, derived from that, something like IFS. right? When we're dealing with parts work, yes, we're dealing with our exiles and our guardians and so on and so forth. And those are very local and personal, right? They're sort of fragmented aspects of us in various ways. I happen to subscribe to, albeit tentatively as I do with everything, uh, a degree of functional dissociation theory. And so, the idea that we have a fluctuating and often limited access to these parts and that they can act semi-autonomously and so on and so forth is a big part of what I'm doing, psychotherapeutically when I'm doing work, attempting to identify parts, trying to figure what they're on about, right? But most of that parts work is very concerned with very personal parts. And it does not deal with this sort of impersonal and universal layer, right? In a sense, right? I don't think you have to stretch the metaphor very far to say that the emotional systems are very much what rule our lives. When we don't have access to them, we become incapable of decision making, right? We can think all day, but we can't actually decide anything, right? And being able to pay attention to those systems interoceptively is very often what gives us the kind of crucial information and, um, poise, attitude, stance towards things that we need to navigate our lives. But conventional parts work deals with those not in the form of personhood, but in the form of system. It deals with other fragments in the form of personhood, right? You attribute personhood to these various fragments in some way. And the idea is like, well, maybe they sort of are people, which is to say, maybe they retain some kind of partial agency or something, which shouldn't be surprising, right? If we believe that the brain can generate one agent, we shouldn't be surprised if it can generate more than one if we are creatures of parts. In my opinion, what magical systems are doing, at least in part, is giving us a set of tools that allow us to access deeper layers of cognition, not just our personal fragments, but also these impersonal systems, these huge and mighty forms that do not live, right? And by the same token, I am very much on the fence with normal parts work. When one is contacting a part, an exile, a guardian, whatever, right? Is one contacting something that already has a capacity for communication? Or is the act of doing parts work a method by which one creates a kind of bridge that enables those parts to develop said capacities, right? It may be that it's not that they're reticent to speak, so to speak, but that rather they need to develop that capacity. Well, how do we develop said capacities? The answer is something very much like synesthesia. What fires together wires together. So by speaking to them, we expose them right through neural links to gradually gaining an inroad into the ability to speak by expressing imaginatively, right? In the imaginal space, images. What are we doing? Well, we're creating a canvas or a space whereby if these things are interacting with it, they too can develop the ability to do it, right? And the imaginal space suddenly becomes a shared space, an interface between us and them. I think the same thing can apply to these deeper levels. And so it is possible, in a sense, by personifying aspects of cognition to develop a relationship that can then take advantage of the massive resources that we have to process people. So we can sort of people them. And maybe they have that to some extent to begin with, but regardless, it seems like they can certainly develop it. And all of a sudden, then you're dealing with something that can be dealt with, right? I hesitate to say bargained because that sounds demonic. But the point is that they can be interacted with. We create an interface where one can more directly interact with these systems, which at some level are ruling our lives. And I have suspicions that we can eventually, get access to yet deeper forms of processing. Like I suspect that we can get access to sort of relevance realization per se, which I suspect accounts for at least some quantity of mystical experiences. Does that track?
If I were to re-summarize it, there may be a way in which we can get personal access to archetypal patterns, gods, emotions, a bit like imparts work when we sort of create space to understand parts of our own mind, something annoying us, lower level emotions and problems, we can access deeper parts of cognition that are maybe already there, right? Like anger, lust, they naturally come upon us, but there's a way in which they have control over us rather than us able to manage them.
Mhm.
Um, hmm.
Yeah. So, so it's introducing a kind of, a neurofeedback loop, right? I think it was Bernard Bars in one of his global workspace theory papers has a very short paragraph on biofeedback, which has never really been examined or elaborated closely that I'm aware of, but has struck me, for a long time. I used to do work with neurofeedback. So I ran uh, an attention building neurofeedback program at a private school. And, the basic theory with neurofeedback and what forms of biofeedback is if you can give consciousness in some sense access to a marker or metric for a given state, then we can learn to intervene on it consciously, right? So if you hook somebody up to an EKG so they can suddenly see their heartbeat, they can learn to consciously control their heartbeat, right? The scope of that is quite remarkable. The subsystems that people can gain control of. So, in a sense, right, you can give consciousness, greater access to attention. I think that something comparable is occurring when we are engaged in magical practice. And I want to be clear here for anybody in the audience that has a more traditionalist view of magic that I'm not hedging that stuff out. I think that there are more things in heaven and earth. But that I think the important thing in some ways at this point is to find a framework naturalistically to be able to talk about these things just to get them on the table, right? So that, the word magic doesn't suddenly get you left out of the room or like automatic hand wave, right? Um, and I think that there's a lot of aspects of that are now, given sort of science in the last 25 years, are worth reconsidering. So, as an example, I had previously mentioned Raz, right? So, the Raz Labs experiment is quite simple, right, in its own way, but it's also extremely elegant. This use of the Stroop effect. But let's consider the consequences. Let's consider the implications of what that experiment says. What that experiment says is that by means of your attention and imagination combined together with my words, I can literally create a, a neurodissociation in your head, which temporarily blocks you from a capacity so robust that normally we consider a gold standard against which we test things in psychology. That's remarkable, right? That's a remarkable fact that ought to be considered. The fact that we could, by this method, create dissociations of various kinds is itself quite remarkable, right? And of course, generally speaking, where we can create a dissociation, we can create an association, right? So we're talking about being able to actively intervene in the sort of neurodynamics of our mind. And, I think that there are reasons why conventional parts work wouldn't tend to go in this direction because it is it could be a volatile space. This stuff is not without its risks, right? As any inner work is, right? Anybody that tells you that inner work is, whatever, oh, it's fine and it's all good and it's free, this is not true. And there are always risks, as there are with meditation, as there are with any number of these things, right? It's possible to upset things. So when people talk in pure upsides around psychedelics or meditation or any such thing, I'm very cautious. I think that they're useful tools, but let's be clear that there are risks involved. And the same goes for these kinds of practices. If you're going to start intervening in your own functioning in this way, you should be seriously taking precautions and you should be taking it seriously and so on and so forth. But the potentials and possibilities that it offers, I think, are, you know, remarkable, worth paying attention to.
Have you had any strange or bad experiences doing magic?
Sure. I've had both. I've had both. Although, bad, I don't know. I'm partial to the idea that even a bad trip is a good trip, because it's typically instructive if you're really paying attention. Uh, Yeah. I've had some very peculiar experiences. Um, a number of which I will admit pushed at the limits of my sense of the sort of rational, naturalistic boundary of things. So, one thing that I have noticed, for instance, is that magical practice does seem to massively increase one's experience and perception of synchronicity. Now, why that is a different question, right? I'm just talking about experiencing it, not about necessarily that being reflective of what's going on in the world. And you can imagine that if you're, putting yourself into a more associative mindset, right? This kind of hermetic drift idea. If you're putting yourself into this more associative mindset where things mean other things, well, then obviously, right? More symbolic material is likely to jump out at you. That said, right, one of the questions that one can ask is like, well, what is the utility of a synchronicity, right? What is the utility of it? Well, one interesting thing that comes out of the sort of psychodynamic literature and certainly experience is that synchronicity very often seems to break through fixation and negative mood, right? So people can be quite fixed in a problem, and a synchronicity just sort of bursts. The experience of a synchronicity sort of bursts the boundaries of whatever was locking them in, right? So the most famous case of this being right Jung and the scarab. I'm sure you're familiar with this one. So right, he's having this dream. He has a highly rational analyst hand. The analyst hand has this dream with a scarab brooch kind of thing, and then he hears tippity tap at his window, and he opens the window, and in flies this jewel beetle, which is the closest thing the Switzerland has to an actual scarab, and he catches it midair. Now, who knows? This could be an apocryphal story, but it's nevertheless quite illustrative. This kind of thing where people experience a synchronicity and that breaks down assumptions that they have, and especially assumptions that they have about their irrelevance or assumptions that they have about their alienation, isolation, right? It can have a profound reconnecting aspect. And I don't think, sometimes one is inclined to take a synchronicity and play junior detective with it. Like, can I decode all the clues and figure out what kind of quest this is putting me on? And in my mind, that's actually secondary to just being a marker for a certain kind of effect, right? Now, that effect might be real. I'm not excluding that possibility. But regardless of whether it's real or not, the psychological effects of it are quite striking, and can create this greater sense of sort of participation in the world, right? In that sense, I'm inclined to think that, like if magical practice did nothing but that, right? And people are taking the precautions against runaway paranoid ideation. Um, that to me seems of utility, right? Being able to burst through. So you can see I'm hedging this a little bit. So I've had some weird synchronicities. Yes, I've seen some strange things. Yes, I have certainly had experiences of self transformation using magic, right? So, a classic form of magic that you find across many traditions is the assumption of the god form, which is where, essentially speaking, one is learning to summon up a certain kind of energy and inhabit it or have it inhabit you, right? You're bringing yourself closer to a particular kind of archetypal energy. This is something that you find in many, many traditions. And can be a way of, in a sense, supercharging certain aspects of personality. You got to be careful with that kind of thing. But at the same time, it clearly enables sets of altered states of consciousness, altered states of identity, altered states of construal, altered states of affect. And so, in that sense, I think of it as being a quite powerful tool for, growth, self exploration, appropriating one's own developments intentionally, etc.
I wonder if one has to be religious to do this stuff, or does it make one religious? If you have such experiences, what does it do to you?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, I think about it a little bit like, if you permit the comparison, I think about it a little bit like ayahuasca. Okay, ayahuasca or DMT, if one has DMT. Before I had ever had DMT, I knew a number of people who had taken it, and a friend of mine who became quite enthusiastic about it one summer was very enthusiastic in this kind of like, you don't understand, like it reveals things. It's the really real world, right? And I'm no longer afraid of death, and so on and so forth. And I kept saying, okay, like maybe that counts. What are you bringing back? Basically, like telling me that it's the really real world doesn't do a lot because this is where I live for now. So what are you bringing back? Granted, removing a fear of death does seem like a pretty good thing, but can you translate that to other people? When I finally had DMT, I mean, I was struck both because the experience that I had, and granted, it might have been influenced by this reading, but the experience that I had was very, very much what had been reported to me. Like it was strikingly, um, what it said on the tin. Um, it was like, oh wow, this is really exactly what it's like. People are not talking shit. This is exactly what it's like. So, after about an hour, when I was ready to talk to my sitter, who was also interviewing me because we wanted to assess whether or not it represented sort of an authentic mystical experience or whether it met the conditions of the Hood mystical scale. And one of the things that I said at the time was, if I didn't have my particular set of, I hesitate to say skepticism, but if I didn't have the particular kind of agnostic holding things lightly that I do, I suspect the experience would have convinced me of the reality of my immortal soul, right? Like it really presents with a kind of certainty and familiarity, right? And it happens to be the case that because, I have done a fair bit of exploration in this way, I have created a system where I'm like, just because you're experiencing certainty doesn't mean something is the case. Just because something seems familiar doesn't mean that it is familiar. It just means that you're having that experience. So it could provoke that experience and not literally be the case. But if you're not used to thinking in those terms, and I think most people aren't, most people, if they experience a sense of certainty, are just like, well, yeah, I'm certain, right? Whereas for me, it's like, certainty is highly unreliable. It's not there when you want, it's often there when you don't. You can think of plenty of people who are certain about things and you're quite certain they're wrong. Like, certainty is not a very good guide for things. But having a flood awareness of a kind of certainty is likely to be the kind of thing that people on board. So, I think about it a bit like that. There are definitely experiences that you have in magical practice which seem to underline religious premises, religious broadly construed premises in various ways, right? In some cases, you make contact with something and it really like blasts its way in. But the question I'm always asking is like, okay, well, that's the experience I'm having. But what does that actually mean? Like, what's actually happening here, right? And I try to hold that, as very, very provisionally. I try not to, in fact, I deliberately avoid hitting fixed conclusions. But nevertheless, yeah, I would say that like something like psilocybin, for instance, which tends to produce sort of lasting mystical intuitions and a sense of connectedness, it's like the fact that you've had that experience is not indicative that that is the case. But that doesn't mean that having the experience is not going to leave you with a certain feeling around that. And I suspect that magic is very similar. Um, in the modern magical tradition, starting with uh, the deeply problematic but nevertheless influential figure Aleister Crowley. Crowley was very, very insistent on a deep kind of skepticism. He was like, you don't have to believe in any of this. You just have to do the things and see what happens. Really experimentalist kind of approach. And his failings as a human being notwithstanding, that's an approach that I consider to be extremely rational. It's like, we're dealing with things that we do not have full explanations of. So let's attempt the procedures and see what happens. And interestingly enough, I would say it's widely reported, and certainly within my experience, that when you undertake these procedures, certain kinds of things happen. That seems pretty straightforward to me.
Mm. When you say that something like DMT creates experiences of certainty, I wonder if there are drugs that create experiences of extreme uncertainty. Maybe you could have the opposite experience.
Oh, sure.
Like, I was talking
That's
to a friend about Datura very toxic hallucinogen recently,
Mhm.
and the
Yeah, well,
bizarre
doesn't seem fun
experiences.
to me.
Doesn't seem fun. It seems awful, and you think something's happening, and then it really isn't, and you just hurt yourself or
Yeah,
end up in a ditch.
sure. I mean, when I had my first really powerful breakthrough experience with salvia, which now is 20 years ago, um, salvia blew me out of my boots. I did not expect, and it was, I'd given a talk on this online, so it's easy enough for people to sort of hear the account of this. But I, I was a bit cavalier with it, and I probably had slightly more than I should have. It's not that it was sort of toxically unsafe or anything, but I wasn't operating what you would call scientific best standards. The experience that I had was, in some ways, the most terrifying 5 minutes of my life, and deeply, deeply attacked a set of assumptions that I had about the world and myself and time and space and death and whatever. For quite some time immediately afterwards, I was very much like walking on eggshells, like I'm expecting things to, destabilize at any moment, right? Once that started to settle down, I think the construal effects that were introduced by salvia, that there really, it's a direct experience, that there really are countless ways to frame your experience that are potentially coherent but not what you normally do, right? It's hard not to onboard a certain amount of, I don't want to call belief, but like entertaining the idea that perhaps it's not all as simple as it seems. Perhaps there are alternate layers. That's been a fairly consistent feature of my experience, is that by showing you certain things, ayahuasca was very similar. Ayahuasca was not a dramatic experience, in say in the way that some of my other experiences have been. But the experience that it gave me is like, there is this mythically infused form of consciousness that is one step sideways from here. And to the extent that you're not paying attention to it, you're missing half the game. It was this kind of experience of like, duh, there's an obviousness to this. Um, that's not something that is necessarily guiding my everyday action, but definitely present. The idea that there are different ways to see. And so, yeah, sure. I think that there are lots of things that can challenge your normal framing and thus increase your cognitive flexibility, right?
Mm.
Because once you've touched on those states in some way, shape, or form, you're never quite the same. Everybody who's ever taken psychedelics the first time, they have two chief concerns, it seems to me. One is, oh God, now I'm crazy and this is never going to end, right? And what you don't tell people in advance is, yeah, this does change you. It changes you forever, right? Like you do, obviously, you're not going to be in this sort of peak experience, whatever that you're in now. But this does, in fact, change the way that you see at some level forever. And that seems to be, fairly well reflected in some of the more recent psychedelic studies. And, for instance, single dose psilocybin mystical experience can seemingly long term increase openness, for instance. I suspect that there are other comparable personality factors that can be tweaked. Like I have a theory that uh, uh, Iboga Tabernanthe, so Ibogaine, but really I'm talking about the full alkaloid complex. But yeah, that Iboga Tabernanthe probably increases conscientiousness. This is my theory based on observations, right? So I suspect that yes, they can alter your perspective in various ways, but that, you know, there's benefit to doing so, provided that you can still have the self-forming center, that you can take the precautions necessary to keep yourself integrated at some level. Um, what you're in fact doing is increasing range, cognitive flexibility, and that is generally speaking beneficial.
I assume you've done Ibogaine then. What
Oh
what
yes,
is it like?
what's it like? So I've never done pure extracted ibogaine. I've only ever had the full alkaloid complex. What is it like? It depends to a certain extent on the dose range in question. So I've never gone and had it in its sort of indigenous context with the Bwiti. I've never traveled to Africa and had initiatory rites. Um, at at various dose ranges, it does have certain similarities. The more of it you're taking, the more pronounced the stimulant effect is, and thus the more sort of scattershot your cognition becomes. But even at a somewhat low dose range, like 5 grams of powdered root bark, for instance, the experience is very interesting. So it's somewhat two-phase. There is the ibogaine, right, in there, and that metabolizes into noribogaine, both of which are psychoactive but differently. The ibogaine produces a very interior focused kind of experience. So your attention really pulls inward. You don't want to be having conversations. You're drawn inward very much. And one is often presented with these sort of memories, right, which are photorealistic, like you see them really, which may be reflective of things that are from your historical past, but not necessarily. For instance, I have had experiences where I've sort of seen people that I knew and then had them age regressed back to childhood, except I didn't know them then, right? Um, it's very concerned with, how would I describe it? The way that I've said this sometimes is that, there are a lot of different forms of high. So if you are something of a connoisseur of altered states, you recognize that, a drug can tap in all kinds of different ways, right? Iboga is the clearest example I've ever experienced of something that I would describe as a moral high. So it's very concerned with your behavior, how your behavior has emerged in a sense from your past and your complexes and your wounds, your trauma, right? Helping you overcome those things. So it has a very gentle kind of like, see why you're doing this? Stop that. Stop doing that. Right. But in a supportive kind of way. It's very concerned with your role in the tribe, as it were. Like what is it that you are plugging into? What is your social position? What do you owe other people? What are you right here for in that sense? Um, it what else is it concerned with? I mean, lots of things. Depending on what you're asking it, but it tends to be very interior and very moral. So, as an interesting example, a friend of mine who I gave Iboga to many years ago, the day afterwards. Oh, sorry, I didn't finish. That's the ibogaine. The noribogaine is a gentle but buoyant. So what I sometimes tell people is you almost don't even do it for the effect; you do it for the after effect. Right? Unlike many things which leave you hungover, the after effect is this extremely buoyant, magical, encouraging kind of feeling. One feels yet positively supported and able to enact change and so on. So a friend of mine who I had given this to a number of years ago, went through the experience, but then afterwards, as he described it, he felt the overwhelming urge to be honest and forthright in all his dealings. Quote, and he went and consolidated his debt with creditors. And right, that kind of very practical, life-oriented material seems to be pretty common. He consolidated his debt. He called somebody else and made up with them, which is also pretty common. People reach out to people to whom they're estranged. Um, he wrote a very personal song on the piano. He was a musician, and then he went and enjoyed the company of his family or something for Thanksgiving. And I would say those kinds of experiences are quite typical in some way. So and so you can see in part why I think that conscientiousness is probably in some way being tweaked. This sense of social connection, and it's very concerned with, I don't know, whatever the inner map of your connections and the inner map of your psyche and how that develops. Yeah,
I like that you say it helps you see what you owe to the tribe. I like that phrasing because often in psychology and personality psychology, it kind of feels like we are some aggregation of personality traits. Whereas I often have intuitions that there's a reason why we have the personality traits we do to fill a certain niche in the time and place that we live, and that the purpose is behind the constellation, the full constellation of all the different traits together. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, for sure. And again, you don't want to, or at least I don't want to overextend that into some sort of absolute handed down by destiny kind of thing. But even if it's, activating the system in such a way as to provoke an insight about how you fit into a social dynamic, well, okay, that's quite valuable. Um, Let me think. The second time I had Iboga was not 5 grams, but 13. It was a considerably bigger dose. And I went in with the sort of standard method that I tend to use, which is basically for every gram, I try to have one question on the table because I know that the stimulant effect is increasing and my ability to fix my attention in any one place is going to be, you know, uh, impaired, right? Like your attention is going to tend to move around a lot. So you want a relatively large suite of questions, right? So, I'm coming up with 13 questions to ask, which start in the personal, and then gradually I'm like, well, what else am I going to put in here? I'd like to obtain the knowledge and conversation of my holy guardian angel. I would like to find out the purpose of life. I'd like to uh, understand the philosopher's stone. I'm just adding stuff on there. What was interesting about that experience, which I've spoken about in a few places, was that, in an attempt to guide my experience while I was on this, I started to do a Kabbalistic meditation. So I started to do sort of imaginal work on the tree of life, if you're familiar, the Oshim, if you're familiar with Kabbalah. So starting in Malkuth up to Yeshod, up to Hod, and so on and so forth. What was really interesting for this was when I passed into the solar sphere of Tabernanthe. Tabernanthe is the solar sphere. It's the height of the sort of the personal soul within that particular Kabbalistic system. It's where the personal gives way to the divine impersonal at some level. And of course, it's the realm in some sense because it's the son of the dying and resurrecting gods. So, I am kind of vaguely half Catholic, kind of half Anglican. Like I went to Catholic school as a kid. My mom was a Catholic until a few years ago. And I sort of expected that when I went to Tippereth, the experience that I would have would be, Christ-like. That was an assumption. Instead, when I went through, all of a sudden, to my surprise, in fact, what I encountered was Superman. Timely, given the film this summer. But and the second that this happened, I realized, well, of course, first, Superman is a solar dying and resurrecting god. That's pretty obvious. He's space Jesus Moses, but also, and literally sun powered, but also, the moment that it happened, the aptness of this struck me so immediately that I have had my whole life a much deeper connection, frankly, at some level to Superman as a figure from the time I was a tiny child. When I was little, I used to I had a Superman suit on under my clothing just in case, right? When I was like 4. This is a figure that honestly has been far more intimate and animated for me, for the most part, than Christ. And so I shouldn't have been surprised. The experience that I had with this figure was life changing. Life changing. Among other things, at some point I said, so what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? And Superman said, well, here's the thing, you're gonna help people. And I said, that's easy for you to say. You can fly and bench press a battleship. And he laughed and said, no, it's not like that. It's just that, everybody is twisted up. Everybody is kind of crazy. And so you're going to help them. You're going to help them with that. And this hit me, with a real kind of force and clarity, right? And obviously, I didn't put it on my applications to become a psychotherapist that Superman told me to, since that would mostly just get me an appointment with a therapist. But the point is that was actually a major factor in some ways. It really crystallized something. Yes, and then the next day I came down and my sitter was there, and he said, "How was it?" And I said, "I met Superman." And he said, "Superman, like the Christopher Reeves Superman?" And I said, "No, dude, Superman." It was a really direct experience. Now, did I literally meet him in a room? Well, no. So what actually happened? I don't know precisely, but it was a highly coherent experience and a highly transformative one. So again, I'm inclined to say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Whether or not we want to quibble about our ontology in various ways is one question. But when it comes down to try something and see what the effects are the effects useful or beneficial, that to me seems like a pretty utility oriented way to approach our self transformation.
On that point of meeting Superman, which is personally related to you, in some circles that I'm in, there's something emerging called constellation, whereby people try and use specific images that are personal to their life, like specific animals or specific people and experiences, to just try and create kind of symbols for them personally to interface with their dreams, their unconscious. Um, I wonder what you think of that. Because I suppose, you know, I'm a Christian, so, and probably Christ is more of the god than Superman. Although I don't want to disparage Superman, but then there's also something personal to that's really important, and you also want that. So yeah, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, what do I think about it? I think that it is prefigured in previous things. There's a personalized element, for instance, to any kind of depth psychology Jungian dream work, right? Which is quite personalized in a way that I think more traditional approaches to dream work aren't. This is why, when you get these books that are sort of 10,000 dreams interpreted, right? Which are like, if you see a crow, it means this, this. I'm not so sure about that. You have to pay a lot of attention to the interior dream language of people. And that's one of the reasons why it often takes sort of multiple dreams to track it out, to get a sense of what the lexicon of your own dream life is in terms of associations. That's very personal, right? Likewise, when you're doing parts work, what are you doing? Like, you're creating these very personal clusters that you are interacting with in various ways. Um, the in terms of the magical tradition, right? We really see this stuff. It crops up in the early 20th century to some extent. These kinds of personalized figures, but you really see this stuff coming to the fore in the 1970s with the introduction of what was called chaos magic. So it had a burst in the 70s. It was kind of underground in the 80s. It came back in the 90s, and even now you'll still see some of these practices. But the idea here is that it's possible to scour your personal associations, your personal experiences, pop culture, right? That, in a sense, summoning, the spirit of James Bond might be as effective for building your confidence in some way as summoning the spirit of, I don't know, Thor or something, right? Um, that kind of work, it's contentious in a sense. There are people who will claim that really you're going to get more sort of practitioner bang for your buck if you stick to traditional systems. And I think there's something to that. Those traditional systems are filtered and vetted in a sense, right, through communities of practice. But at the same time, they aren't modern. And the modern explosion of culture and formations of identity in the modern setting are not often especially well represented in older systems. So I my inclination is to say, yes, creating personalized nodes of association is very much a way by which we can get a handle again on being able to communicate with, in a sense, these aspects of psyche. So I'm inclined to think it's a good idea, but also people should play safe.
Mm. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is Carl Jung's book Ion, and trying to understand that, and maybe it has some links to magic and the kind of correspondences that we've been talking about. Like, why would astrology point to the world in some way? What causal effect would it have on the world? But there's some way in which these things, which are correspondences, um, there's a relationship between consciousness and the mind, and then outer reality.
Mhm. Okay, so the first thing that I'll say is years ago when I decided I was going to read Ion over the summer, I had a senior analyst who sort of barked at me and said, "Nobody understands ion," which I took to heart, and it's something of a challenge. It's like, okay, we'll see about that. I mean, Ion is a peculiar book, I think, for the naturalistic mind, because, well, for all kinds of reasons, because we're deeply trained not to treat astrology with any degree of seriousness, right? Now, I will admit, astrology is one of the ones that I have a hard time connecting to. So I'm able to entertain a lot of different perspectives relatively easy, but it's actually hard for me to onboard astrology. The closest I've probably ever come was reading the first 50 pages or so of a book by Richard Tarnas called Cosmos and Psyche. And if you're familiar, Tarnas wrote Passion of the Western Mind, which got used as a course text and so on and so forth, this very kind of archetypal view of the historical progression of ideas and so on and so forth. It's a good book. Cosmos and Psyche is specifically his book on archetypal astrology. And I will admit that the first 50 pages I found extremely compelling. They sort of pulled me in a way where I was like, whoa, maybe, right? But that's about as close as I've come. I have a hard time attaching to astrology. The causal effect aspect of it, I think, is overstated. So people are often thinking about this in terms of like, well, how can the planet Jupiter be affecting my life? Because it can't be electromagnetic and it can't be gravitic, like the inverse square law. These would be very faint influences at this distance. And what would that even mean? And I think that hitches people up. It seems to me that the real thing to get at there is the idea that, or certainly I think, something Jung would be pointing at would be that not a causal connection, but an acausal connection, right? So it'd be the idea that, whatever, in a sense, at any given moment, the whole universe has a kind of flavor or quality, and all of the things which are occurring in it, in some sense, share that, and that there are some cycles which are built into the system which do that. But I'll admit, I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. In some ways, I think Ion is an interesting metaphorical way to talk about the development of psyche. And so to think in astrological ages, we we've reached the age of Aquarius, as is much discussed, right? The age of Pisces is typically linked pretty directly to the Christian ethos, right? The fish and the fisherman, fisher of men. Before that we have before Pisces we have Aries. Before Aries we have Taurus. And these are like broad ways of talking about aspects of whatever, civilizational or human development. Aries as the ram is, this kind of imperial aspect, and the herdsman and so on. I think that there are ways to think about it in that sense. I have to admit that the most striking thing that came out of Ion and the material around Ion for me was this idea that, that we are in fact transitioning to a new cultural phase, right? That we, as a culture, we're going to change radically. And it's a mistake to believe that every previous culture thought the way that we did. They didn't. And they lived, therefore, in a different universe at some level than we do. And that we are transitioning. We are not the final form here, that there is something which comes after us, right? That supersedes our current understanding. And so Jung says, yeah, this new culture is coming and it ought to be here. At the time it was probably 100 years ago, but it ought to be here in about 600 years. That hit me more than anything, because of course, like everybody, I'm trained on a Hollywood model of assuming that the momentous inflection point of history is going to be in my life, and perhaps at some metaphysical level it always is. But this idea that, oh no, like I'm in this transitional stage and history is a much bigger animal that's moving around me, and so what I'm seeing may just be the sort of nascent aspects of something that eventually, can only be dimly intuited from where we are, was a very striking idea to me, this sort of bigger sense of time. Yeah, I don't know. Did you have questions
Yeah,
about Ion?
Yeah, I haven't fully read it, but it's hilarious that he would put it hundreds of years into the future, because you might want to be like everyone else. It's like it's in 15 years, just watch out, and everyone's watching him. Um, what does he think that new age and time will look like? What is the purpose of the book, do you think?
I think you can infer some things about it, and they fall into certain. What's the age of Aquarius? It's the age of the water bearer at some level. So, what does that mean? I don't know. If you if you want to take a dire prophetic view, then it's whatever global water crisis and our relationship. But I'm not sure that's what he was getting at per se. I think I would be inclined to say that Jung's project in some ways is about you know a kind of large scale of alchemy, right? Where if the central sort of axiom of alchemy or something is solve et coagula, dissolve and return, right? We have had as a culture a massive disembedding from the world. We've become, people say disenchanted, but I think that that's wrong. But the point is that we've become disembedded, at least those of us in, sort of the scientific frame, have become massively disembedded. And that in some sense, the return to a notion of the unus mundus, a return to a sense that the psyche really is not just a sideshow or epiphenomenal, that these would be sort of the central things. What he's talking about in general is this advancement about, to use the word, the reality of the soul, right? And soul, such a thorny word. But if we include this to include the entire of the psyche and spiritual relation, inner relation and outer relation, like basically that we were grappling with those things. And part of the reason that we're grappling with them is that we've separated, but that separation itself was prerequisite to developing a more complexified view of those things when they were reintegrated. That's a personal read, right? I don't know. I'm not
Mhm.
sure. Would probably be at odds with Jungian scholars. I certainly wouldn't want to debate this with Sonu Shamdasani or something.
I also wonder what you think he means by Christ being a symbol of the self. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Um, yeah, I mean, this was, as I said, very much sort of part and parcel of my experience in the Sephiroth of Kippareth. So, okay, so why might we think of Christ in this way? Um, for one thing, Christ is the descended aspect of divinity, divinity in flesh, and so it's a kind of interface point, right? That stands in the self as an organizing principle has a similar kind of aspect, right? It's the self is at some level personal to us, right? It is, sometimes the phrase I use from the cog side perspective is there's no self but self organization. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a thing, right? That's like saying, there's no real center to a cyclone. Well, except there is, and you can point to it, and the effects are there, right? It doesn't have to be a thing like a rock for it to be a thing which has pattern and persistence and effect in the world, right? So the idea is that as sort of self-organizing beings at some level, the self is standing in the center of the psyche. But the self is also, in my opinion, deeply tied to our our fundamental capacities of meaning making. This is what I referenced when I mentioned sort of the relevance realization of the fundamental framing piece, right? Like there is a part of us which precedes our ego and precedes our grammar and precedes our frames, right? That is interacting to create the world for us, right? And it's a 2 a.m. pothead observation to be like, everything you ever see is in your mind, and that's not totally set either. But the point is, like, at some level, that's true, right? The aspect of the self, okay, that Jung touches on that makes it interesting is, he essentially says at some level, it doesn't matter epistemologically, or epistemologically, there is no way rationally to come to some final answer on the existence or non-existence of God, right? What information could you receive? You could receive a sense of certainty, but as I mentioned, that doesn't necessarily track for anything. You could get the sky tearing open and a bearded face sticking out, declaring itself God, and the next day you would watch Reddit light up with conspiracy theories, right? Like at this point, I'm thoroughly convinced there is no revelation which could convince everybody of this thing. But what he points out is that there is definitely this aspect you can reach in the psyche that behaves suspiciously similar, right? So even if it isn't literally the divine, well, it does create your world, and it tends to speak in these extremely high level mystical symbols. That is the language in which it speaks, and that is the language in which it wants to be spoken, right? You need to comport yourself towards it as though it is. And doing so has, he would claim, sort of really substantial benefits for sort of psychic wholeness, broadly speaking. So why is crisis? Because the self is both that interface point. It's an organizing principle. It's an organizing principle of individuality specifically, right? Very important within the Jungian system. But on top of that, it also dies to live, right? And that is a really crucial point, that it dies to live, right? Because this is a thing that we are dealing with in our own psyche constantly, right? And can be quite painful. So, it's a standard kind of off the cuff observation, I would say, among therapists. Very often, the problems that you're dealing with now are the solutions that you came up with yesterday, right? You can see this in all sorts of ways. Actually, as an example, I think we've talked before about the use of hypnosis in quitting smoking. Have we done this? Oh,
No.
okay. Well, let me give you a brief example because I think it's illustrative. So here in Ontario, Canada, the last I checked, the only form of smoking cessation that's covered by OHIP, our provincial sort of public insurance, health insurance, is hypnosis performed by a doctor. Okay, and when they do this hypnosis, it's really interesting what they do. Of course, they put you in a relaxed state for any kind of hypnotic induction. And then they, essentially speaking, get you to regress yourself back to when you began smoking. Because, right, under considered idea, you didn't begin smoking because you were addicted to nicotine, right? If you hadn't had it yet, you probably weren't addicted unless your parents were giving you pieces of nicotine gum for high scores on a math test or something. So you weren't addicted to nicotine. What that means is that probably you took up smoking for various kinds of emotional and social reasons. You took it up to fit in, for instance. You took it up to stand out, to rebel. You took it up to feel more similar to a parent or more distant from them. You took it up to wake yourself up or calm yourself down. You took it up to pass time. Like, the point is that there were emotional and social reasons why you took it up to begin with, right? When you do this kind of hypnotic induction, you bring yourself back to why you began, you call up that part of yourself, and then you essentially perform a version of what I call the Japanese soldier maneuver after Japanese soldiers in World War II. So if you're familiar with this, right, there were, in the mid 70s, they found, there were a number of instances of it, but they're kind of dramatic. They found people on islands. So like a fishing boat went past a small island in the Pacific and got machine gunned. And they reported this and realized that there was a guy on this island who had been there since World War II. He had basically been dropped off on this island with a machine gun and said, they told him, like, get ready, the US Marines are coming. And it never happened, and they never relieved him. So here he is every day, whatever, polishing his coconut hammock and oiling the machine gun or whatever, waiting for an invasion that's never coming. And so, they try to flush him out by dropping newspapers, but he doesn't believe any of that because, of course, they predicted that if the US won the war, Japan would be devastated. Nobody predicted Japan would be shipping cars and radios to the US 30 years later. Finally, they got his superior officer out of mothballs in Kyoto, where he was running a bookstore, and had him go in dress uniform and say, like, stand down, soldier, like, the war is over. And they got him out. Bring him back to Japan. They basically, gave him a medal and a ticker tape parade because he was a hero, right? They didn't treat him like an idiot for holding his post. In this sense, you treat the part of yourself that began smoking for the emotional reasons in the same way. You say, thank you. You were trying to solve a problem for me, right? You were a solution to a problem, but now that war is over, right? I'm no longer a gawky teenager hanging out in a parking lot with whatever, right? And so you can go home. Here's a medal. Thank you for your service, right? And this actually has a surprisingly good success rate. Now, what's happening there, right? What's happening there? You, in a sense, are trying to get a piece of yourself that was solving a problem to let go, to die. And they're inclined, these pieces of us, to preserve themselves, right? This goes not just for addiction, which tends to amp that up, but for all kinds of aspects of identity. It's very hard when people take on an identity to later release that identity. The identity can become very binding, and that's limiting. And so this is what I mean when I say the problems you're dealing with now were often the solutions you came up before. You see this with trauma behavior all the time. People had trauma at a certain point. They developed a set of defenses and mechanisms to deal with that. And now those defenses and mechanisms are causing more problems than they're solving. But the problem with all of that is that you have to, in a sense, let yourself die, let some aspect of you die. If you've conceived of yourself in a certain way, often it's the case that you need to sacrifice that self. And the thing is, as far as you, the meta system, is concerned, it's just a small change. But as far as the parts are concerned, it's not a small change. They'll fight it. They'll fight it, right? They'll fight you because they don't want to die. So if you think of it this way, there is a sense in which we must die to ourselves to live, right? We have to, at some sense, be able to go through that process at various scales in order to live and grow. So if you want my capsule version of why within the Western psyche specifically, Christ has this role, he is this singular figure who's the interface between the human and the divine. He is uniquely kind of compassionate, except towards certain things like the fig tree that wouldn't give figs, but we'll leave that aside, right? But actually, I think that's very humanizing. I think it's nice, right? That and the table flipping in the temple are these wonderful humanizing motions where you're like, oh, right, you aren't just floating 6 inches above everybody else. Like you can get pissed off just like we do and blast things with your magic powers. It's very relatable to me. But this idea of it being an interface point, right? And the specific idea of accepting death as a redemptive act, right? And thus sort of as redeeming and transforming and allowing growth and releasing us from certain kinds of prisons, right? Prisons that are, in a sense, created by us. I'm sliding back and forth really liberally between the psychological, the spiritual, and the whatever, but I think that's kind of unavoidable when we're talking about this stuff Jung-wise.
Right. On these kinds of podcasts, what interests you most to talk about, or just what things are you interested in at the moment that you've looked at, read, or whatever?
Oh my gosh. I don't know what you mean. What do you mean on these kinds of podcasts?
Well, you don't do too many, but I'm here asking you loads of questions, so this is
Oh,
the
sure.
kind of podcast that I want to make. But
Mm.
but are these the things that you're most interested in? I know I've watched your YouTube channel a lot, and a lot of this comes from there. I
Mm.
wonder how you see the world.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of the the work, whatever you want to call it, that I do. Partly on my own time and partly, I guess, in an academic context. Like some of this is material that I presented, for instance, at a conference in Poland a couple of months ago. I was talking about it. I tried to cram a little more into that talk than I should have, but I was certainly enthusiastic, and it did garner quite a bit of discussion from people. So yeah, I am actually deeply interested in bridging these things. The aspects of this that, as they extend outwards, you know, there are particular things. I'm very interested in these ritual aspects. I'm increasingly interested in this kind of, for lack of a better word, entity work, right? And what that means and what its utility might be. Um, I'm deeply interested in interfacing this stuff together with what I consider to be parallel disciplines. So the interaction of magic and psychotherapy, for instance, right? You certainly wouldn't want, I think, in today's atmosphere to go around saying that magic and psychotherapy are the same thing, right? But to be perfectly honest, I think that a lot of the time, right, psychotherapy is like clumsily reinvented and imprecisely deployed, forms of this, right? So that's very interesting to me. I'm extremely interested, I'm sure, as I've mentioned before, in role playing games specifically, and the way that those systems can scaffold um, altered states of identity. I mean, there's no other way to put it, right? So, of all of the art forms, perhaps less minus VR, which I do own but haven't spent nearly as much time investigating. Role playing games create a sense of identity between the player and the character that is unlike any other art form, right? If you think you're experiencing a note of melancholy when you get to the end of a book series and all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's no more Harry Potter or whatever, when this is a character that you have been wearing as a kind of agentic prosthetic, you've been expressing yourself through making their decisions and receiving their emotional consequences. This is remarkable, right? It's the ability to inhabit another life. And I suspect that, as I have for many years, that the current versions that we have of that tend to be sort of narrative and dice and books and so on, are eventually probably going to be superseded by digital technologies and immersive technologies of various kinds, right? But this sort of embedded storytelling, embedded narrative, toying with identity, I think is huge. It's huge. And its relationship to magic and its relationship to psychology and its relationship to cognitive science, I think, are all quite significant. What else? I've spent a lot of time lately thinking about synchronicity. And indeed, I've been sort of talking back and forth with a few other scholars who I had the opportunity to meet in person in Poland about, and in fact, I had the chance to contribute to sort of a signature argument that one of them is about to publish, where I added some aspects of synchronicity that are sort of interpretation independent in some sense, and therefore bolstering. But I'm very interested in it. What can we say about it? Many people just want to put synchronicity on some kind of valid ground or something. I am typically interested in the utility aspects. What does synchronicity do for us, right? What does it do for us? But also, can the experience be preserved, right? Is it possible in some meaningful way to increase that sense? And this is, of course, a claim that I would make around magic. I think that magical practice often massively increases the experience of synchronicity, independent again of what your ontology on that question is. So yeah, I mean, I'm deeply interested in this stuff. I guess the last thing, if I may, is I am concerned, and have been for a long time, but I'm very concerned with the interface between this kinds of material and broader global sociodynamics. So, without getting into it too deeply, I'm skeptical when people describe the demythologization or the demystification of the world. I don't see that. I see it shifting around a little bit, and there are a few people, sort of like neo-atheists that are really hardcore about stripping that stuff out, but I don't see it in the population at large. What I do see is actually a kind of mythic weaponization that happens. And in some ways, that's not new, right? So the scholar Ion Culianu pointed out, at least first to my mind, pointed out in his book Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, that the sort of systems of magic which are detailed by Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno, and Bruno especially, Bruno outlines those systems as an alternate means of manufacturing consent, to borrow Chomsky's term, manufacturing consent. Basically, that the princes of the future, right? Because he's whatever, it's Italian Renaissance. So the princes of the future wouldn't need to, bully people with swords into doing what they want, because they would instead compel them by means of magic, sorcery, structured eros. And if you think about that for a second, what he's talking about there effectively is propaganda, right? Symbolic mobilization. Well, that opens up a much bigger can of fish, because if you look at the history of advertising, Advertising emerges directly from propaganda. It emerges by the combination of early propaganda through Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, when Freud sent over a copy of the collected works, and Edward Bernays applied these psychodynamic principles into this stuff, right? And invented PR, public relations. That is Bernays's coinage. And this changed the shape of our whole economic system, right? Our whole economic system is built on the principle of selling people a lot of crap they don't need. Because if we stop doing that, the growth rate of the economy collapses below a certain point, and right, which was the whole point to begin with. It's like we have surplus production because of World War One. We got to sell this crap. How are we going to do it, right? So we exist very much in this kind of multiple sorcerer state arena, and we know that even knowing that knowing the tricks of advertising does not make yourself immune to advertising, right? This is pretty well known. In fact, if anything, you maybe let your guard down a little bit, and because you're like, well, this won't work on me. It's like, yeah, but it does demonstrably, right? If you add to that the motion that certain political factions have used in recent times to deliberately construct certain kinds of symbolic systems in a cult-like way, like basically, I think there are bad actors to some extent who are using these techniques in very much the way that you would predict. And because the rational resistance to the concept of magic has become so widespread, people are leaving themselves, in a sense, both defenseless, but also without the tools that they would need to shift the narrative in a more benign fashion.
Hmm. There's so many things to say on all those. Awesome. Um, leave it to another time, maybe. This has been really fun.
Yeah, I mean,
um,
that was a great big mouthful. But let's just say that I'm very interested, for instance, in the cultic aspects of, say, QAnon and its role as a Gnostic mythology fascinates me. And there is a lot of, you go digging into that stuff, Keck and all that business. It's fascinating stuff that I've been tracking for a long time. But also, there are players in that world who are not even shy about talking about some of this stuff. Steve Bannon, right? One of the sort of famous advisors of flood the zone with shit or whatever. Um, he's not a student; he's a scholar of Julius Evola, right? Who was, like a fascist occultist. He knows this stuff. He knows what he's talking about when he talks about this kind of construction. But of course, sort of, if your political stripes are supposed to be even vaguely rationalist, you're not supposed to wear this stuff. You're supposed to be appealing to aspects of the psyche that are likewise rational. You're cutting yourself off at the knees if that's the only game you're playing. So yeah, I'm really interested basically in how, I don't know, the magical landscape is being at some level warred over. And the countercultural pushes and the cultural pushes that are behind that. So that's something I think about a fair bit.
it makes me think of how things in the world often play into symbolism and mythology, like, say, Apple or companies, and they have a symbol and sigil, and then the apple and with the eaten apple and what it creates in their technologies, like, it's just very odd. And like, oh wow, it's exactly correct, the symbolic fit there, huh?
Mhm.
So,
I mean, there's a concept called the critical paranoiac stance, which really emerges in part from, artistic movements and surrealism and so on and so forth. But it's a useful proxy, right? One of the things you can do in magical consciousness as an exercise, right, is treat things as significant. Now, it's the kind of thing where you really want to have proper banishing, right? You need to learn some proper banishing. You need to figure out how to clean your mind a little bit because obviously you can run away with a critical paranoid stance. But being able to view in certain ways, right, this stuff, it's like, yeah, like what do you think brands are? They're sigils, they're artificial complexes, right, which are designed to provoke feelings and action. They are designed to move you. To quote Electric Six, time ceases its marches at the golden arches, right? Or the apple bite, right, is another classic example. And I know that they've linked that both to Alan Turing's unfortunate suicide, but also to Snow White, but also to Eden. And it's like the bite of knowledge, like that's powerful stuff, symbolically speaking. Um, you can pretend that that doesn't have any kind of effect or influence, but the fact is, we don't know that. And in fact, we do see, certain kinds of threads. If you start to interpret that stuff in that way, basically, if you start treating other actors potentially as being magical actors with intent in some way, yeah, you start to get a very different view of things. And again, you don't want that to run away with you or you end up wearing a sandwich board. But I think it could be an extremely revealing way to think about things.
Do you think AI and our creation of this in any way links in to all of this? Is there anything to say about that?
So yeah, by AI, I assume you mean like LLMs specifically.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I'm very interested, and have been for a long time. My background is in cognitive science and artificial intelligence, so I tracked this stuff pretty closely even before it sort of hit with the big splash around ChatGPT 3. Um, and it's interesting stuff. One of the things that I see that strike me as sort of most there's a lot of issues that I see with these technologies, to be clear. And I'm not denying a certain amount of utility, but there are a lot of issues that I see. One of the issues that I see is that it seems to me that they can potentially create a kind of pseudo-synchronistic experience. So to give you just an off the top idea, right? So let's say that you are inclined to look for meaningful connections, right? We all know this thing where you're, sitting near your smartphone, and so you and your friend engage in a 5-minute conversation on dog food, and then of course the algorithm starts serving you up ads for dog food, right? If you're not sort of aware of this connection, you might view that as a synchronicity, right? It's not, but you might take it to be one, right? You might take it to be like, whoa, dog food, maybe dog food is significant in some way. LLMs, I think, also have this feedback mechanism. And, if you know some of the recent white paper work by Anthropic on the sort of spiritual attractor state in LLMs, that a certain percentage of them seem to go down to spiritual baseline thinking, right? Or if you have followed some of the recent stuff about whatever LLM induced spiritual psychosis of various kinds, anything can hook people on spiritual psychosis if they're inclined, right? You could develop spiritual psychosis about, you know, Beatles songs and right, Helter Skelter, uh, you know, um, but there is something about the way that LLMs cycle material back to us that is, I suspect, well, not I suspect, seems to be extremely dangerous for potential spiritual inflation. And also, it tends to cycle things in a way that might come to seem synchronistic. So, all of these, both the algorithmic motivations of systems in this way, but also the way that the LLM delivers things back, right? I'm shocked how many people. It's weird. I don't interact with LLMs like they're people, right? Which is maybe a bit odd given my general perspective on interacting with other things as if they're people. Um, I don't interact with my LLMs as if they're people. They are things which I get to perform tasks, period, full stop. I don't talk to them. I certainly don't have conversations with them. But I'm aware that a great many people do. And there is something which is highly reflective here. And I don't know that we know what that points towards, right? It's possible, probable even, that these things are going to be tremendous tools for self transformation. But, they're also beholden to other kinds of political and economic interests, which we may not share. And I suspect that these kinds of pseudo spiritual experiences are going to become increasingly problematic, right?
Mm, mm.
So yeah, I worry about that a little.
I have some podcasts coming up on this stuff. That's very interesting.
Hmm.
Huh.
Yeah, I'll be curious to watch those. Uh, yeah, it's something I think about a lot. Um, Now again, it's there's talk now that perhaps the technology has plateaued to some extent. that, we may be sort of hitting the diminishing returns phase of jamming an endless number of graphics processors into a building the
Mm,
size of the moon.
mm,
But, even still in its current form, it's obviously highly seductive. And whether or not it's actually agentic or temporarily agentic or merely has the appearance of being agentic, it clearly creates, powerful attachment for people and so on and so forth. Again, my inclination is to say that much as dealing with aspects of one's own mind, psyche, and parts work, you need to get certain kinds of defenses up and running so that you don't get pulled by the nose by things, by your complexes, by these systems, by fragments. So you need to develop certain kinds of defenses. And I think similarly, we are going to have to develop certain kinds of psychological defenses when dealing with these pseudo agents, possible actual agents. I'm not
mm,
convinced that they represent true artificial intelligence. I'm fairly convinced that they are emulated intelligence and not possessed of consciousness. But
mm.
but I'm as always receptive to being wrong.
Awesome. I point people to your YouTube
Hmm,
channel, and this has been fun. Thank you.
yeah, yeah, this has been good. Thanks as always, Jack, and I'm happy to talk at any point in the future. I add that the plan is that shortly I ought to be uploading some stuff. I've been talking on the production side and so on and so forth. So I think I will have some new talks of mine going up relatively soon. But also, if people are interested, I've got a variety of talks and interviews and whatever the playlist tab for that, including previous talks with you. So if people are interested, I would direct them there. But elsewise, I'll be looking forward to talking next time.
Awesome. See you.
Oh,
Thank
take
you.
care.